according to Frederick Spotts, the author of Hitler and the Power of Aesthetics, quotes, "The arts were at the center of Hitler's life, and he was at the center of the arts. He dissolved the line between arts and politics, and through the notorious spectacles, parades, festivals, films, radio, rallies, Wagner's operas, political theatrics, monumental architecture, the Autobahn and the Volkswagen, turned the entire German population into participants in the National Socialist drama," end quotes. Hitler as an artist is exemplified in this first cartoon. In the first panel, the new chancellor confronts a small sculpture of a quarreling mob, a symbol of the chaotic state of German politics in the Weimar Republic. Next, with one blow of his firm fist, he smashes the jumbled mess. Out of the raw material, he then creates a new man, a strong, potent, clenched fist Aryan German. The sculpture of the original statuette, a caricature Jew, at first looks on in dismay as his work is demolished, but by the end, this caricature Jew has vanished. Hitler, in party uniform, under a sculptor's smock, stands proudly as an artist politician. Appropriately, the cartoon was entitled Germany's Sculptor. Unfortunately, Hitler also viewed himself as Germany's doctor, as demonstrated in this slide. His program of, quotes, applied biology, end quotes, was designed to create not a sculptor of an Aryan German, but a living, breathing Vogue of Aryan Germans, free of Jewish and other vermin. And the rest, as they say, is history. Susan Lederer will begin tonight's program with a discussion of the most famous fictional mad scientist of all time, Dr. Victor Frankenstein. Although Mary Shelley wrote the story of Dr. Frankenstein and his monster almost 200 years ago when she was a mere teenager, their myth continues to influence our thinking about genetics, genetic engineering, and what it means to be a human being. And this is particularly important as we enter the age of the Human Genome Project. Professor Lederer is Associate Professor in the section of History of Medicine in the Yale School of Medicine and Associate Professor in History, American Studies, and African American Studies in Yale University. A historian of American medicine, she has published extensively on the history of animal and human experimentation in America and on the development of international codes of ethics for research involving human subjects. In 1994, she was appointed by President Bill Clinton to serve on the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, charged with examining the conduct of the government-sponsored researchers who were doing research with ionizing radiation during the Cold War. She was a contributor, along with Ruth Fadum and other members of the Advisory Committee, to the project presented to the President in 1995, and it was then published in a work entitled The Human Radiation Experiments in 1996. The next year, in 1997, she was the curator for an exhibition on Frankenstein at the National Library of Medicine of the National Institutes of Health, and authored the catalog essay published as, quotes, Frankenstein, Penetrating the Secrets of Nature. With funding from the National Library of Medicine and grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Library Association, a version of the exhibit traveled to some 85 libraries across the country between 2002 and 2005. Professor Lederer's most recent book, Flesh and Blood, A Cultural History of Transplantation and Transfusion in America, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Like her earlier work, which explores ethical issues in clinical and surgical innovations, this book focuses on the social and cultural implications of remaking American bodies through the harvest of other bodies, animal and human, living and dead. Please give a warm Texas welcome to Professor Susan Lederer.
Good evening. It may not be immediately obvious how Frankenstein fits into a lecture series on medical ethics and the Holocaust. After all, what does a novel first published in 1818 by an English teenager who was an unwed mother at the time she wrote the novel have to do with medical ethics, with healing transformed into killing, with eugenics, extermination, and euthanasia? Well, the answer is a great deal, particularly if one considers the legacy of the Frankenstein story, and especially how it has come to epitomize the monstrous, the unnatural, the uncontrolled, and even, perhaps, the unforgivable. In 1933, for example, Adolf Hitler was described as Frankenstein by a young German writer who, not surprisingly, published under a pseudonym. This is actually an advertisement for this book, published again in 1933, the pseudonym Johannes Steele. And in this book, which was published first in German and then in English, translated into English, Steele warned of the monster that was being forged by the National Socialist Party. This is from Steele. A monster has been created and let loose ostensibly to arrest the march of communism and Marxism, but the ghost has become the master of its conjurer. What will there be after Hitler? And Frankenstein was familiar enough that Jewish children being rounded up by Nazi guards were familiar with the figure to nickname one of the most sadistic of these guards, Josef Bloch, there sort of on the end, as Frankenstein. That was the nickname that the children gave him. Well, this evening, what I want to talk about is the origins of this Frankenstein myth and how it has come to provide a framework for articulating ambivalence, profound ambivalence, about things and people out of control. I'm going to look at sort of the myth's continuing utility in discussion of advances of biomedical sciences. And I would also like to suggest that if we return to Mary Shelley's original formulation of Victor Frankenstein, we might find that more useful than the kind of popular cultural distillation or reduction, more useful in meeting the challenges that confront us as a society faced with decisions about these powerful new genetic technologies. Now, in so doing, I trust that you will accept my version of the Frankenstein myth. I think you can distill it into two simple declarative sentences. It's alive, and the equally, or perhaps more ominous, it's escaped. Because of the simplicity of this formulation, the mere prefix, Franken, is a useful or an efficient rhetorical device for branding things as unnaturally created, monstrous, and even from the laboratory. It's hard for me to imagine that you have somehow escaped references to Franken Farms, Franken Foods, Mad Cow, Franken Cow, and let me show you this. Greenpeace, the environmental organization, capitalized on this spoof of Franken-Tony and his genetically modified fakes of corn with, and Franken-food bad, right? Hey kids, get your own gene splicer, untested, unlabeled. This Gary Larson cartoon, I'd suggest, is even more efficient because it doesn't need the word Frankenstein to evoke all that's connoted by a Franken flower. You see him strapped to the gurney, the scars, the struggle to escape, all convey the menace of the monster. Well, the prefix Franken is a versatile one. It can evoke fears about a polio virus created in the laboratory, as well as disquiet about such techno foods as chicken McNuggets. And some of you may be familiar with the lawsuit that was brought against the McDonald's Corporation by several teenagers in New York City who claimed that the chain was liable for obesity and other related health conditions. The judge threw out the case But in so doing, he labeled Chicken McNuggets a McFrankenstein creation of various elements not utilized by the home cook. In a 64-page opinion, he outlined chemicals, food additives, other ingredients that make it such an unnatural product. And by choosing Frankenstein, he chose one that would be immediately recognizable, a cultural shorthand for science out of control. Earlier this year, actually back in January, some of you may have seen some of the discussions about this young girl, a young girl named Ashley who has a very severe disease, static encephalopathy, whose parents went public with a medical treatment given to her to attenuate or stunt her growth. So they also performed a hysterectomy and other hormonal treatments to prevent her sexual maturation. And in the discussion of the ethics of this particular case, there were references and people blogged in and referring to it as Frankenstein-esque. And these discussions also invoked the eugenics movement and what was going on in this particular case about molding people in particular ways for societal reasons. Well, my question tonight then is, how did the Frankenstein story originate, and how did it come to articulate this profound unease about power and potential? Well, let me cast your mind back to the uncongenial summer of 1816, when it rained apparently constantly in Switzerland, where Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, a young woman, spent the summer in close proximity with three influential men. One of them was her lover, the poet and freethinker, the atheist expelled from Oxford for his atheism, Percy Shelley. The other two were the poet Lord Byron and his traveling companion and physician, John William Polidori. They were summering at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Léman near Geneva. And apparently they spent their evenings reading aloud German and French ghost stories when Byron suggested that they actually have a competition to see who could write the best supernatural story. Two of these stories were eventually published. Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, the first vampire story in English, and the other, of course, was Frankenstein, published by Mary Shelley, although her name doesn't appear on this frontispiece, in 1818. Nonetheless, she was 20 years old. So the book was published anonymously, and this excited great speculation about its authorship. But the book also had a dedication. It was dedicated to the radical political philosopher, William Godwin. And people speculated that it had actually been written by Percy Shelley, who was known to be one of William Godwin's most fervent followers and admirers. No one seemed to contemplate the possibility that the book had been written by a young woman, even though she was a young woman of a very impressive literary lineage. Not only was her father William Godwin, her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, the feminist philosopher and author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792, and who died just 11 days after giving birth to her daughter. Now, at the time that the book was published, Mary Shelley was estranged from her father, who, despite his unorthodox living arrangements, was nonetheless disapproving of the fact that Mary had run off to the continent with Percy Shelley, who was already married and the father of two children. And she dedicated the book to her father with the idea that this would bring them closer together. Now, when the book was published in 1818, it received a considerable amount of attention. Only a few months after the book appeared, a friend of the Shelleys noted that it was universally known and read, but it was not universally loved. And there were really some shockingly bad reviews, but it was a strange tale, no doubt. And at its heart were several profound questions. Now, you heard me state earlier that in popular culture, It's Alive and It's Escaped are the main focus. And certainly, It's Alive represents the core of Mary Shelley's story, and it is no incidental pronoun. What is it that Victor Frankenstein animates in his laboratory of filthy creation? And perhaps more importantly, is it even human, what he does? And what is it that makes the creature monstrous? And in fact, Mary Shelley uses a variety of words to describe the creature. He's a wretch, a miserable monster, a thing such as Dante could not have conceived, an abortion, a demoniacal corpse. His physical appearance is hideous, it's unhuman, and several times in the novel, Mary Shelley refers to him as a living mummy. And again, suggestive of the horror that is incited by returning from the boundary of the grave, that is, violation or transgression of that boundary between living and dead. Well, in the novel, in fact, the monster is not an it is a he. But it's a he who lacks a name, who feels cast out from humanity. And when Victor Frankenstein, the creator, usurps the role of the deity, the monster becomes his Adam. And indeed, on the frontispiece of Mary Shelley's novel, Mary Shelley quotes lines from Milton's Paradise Lost to the effect, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" And at least part of the rage that fuels the creature in his sort of subsequent murder spree results from the unwillingness of Victor Frankenstein to make him an Eve, to provide a female monster like himself, so that he will have companionship and not be totally alienated from all other living things. Well, the second theme of Mary Shelley's novel, It's Escaped. And if the nightmare of creating something unhuman is not enough, that is, to use Mary Shelley's words, the creature is not subject to the will of the creator. And I would argue that the Frankenstein story is very much centered on this issue of control, or lack of control, of nature and the natural world. In the novel, Victor Frankenstein casts off his alchemical roots. He abandons the alchemists and their search for the philosopher's stone and the ability to create gold from lead or other base metals. And instead, Mary Shelley actually celebrates the scientific achievements of her day. She has, for example, Victor Frankenstein's professor at the University of Ingolstadt, where he's a student, say the following, talking about contemporary researchers. "These philosophers have indeed performed miracles. They have discovered how the blood circulates, the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of the heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its shadows." So what's the problem? This is Promethean. Well, the problem in the novel, and I think the acute issue, is the failure to use these powers, these godlike powers, with wisdom and responsibility. And at its heart, the Frankenstein novel is about the abdication of responsibility for creation, not creation itself. It's not the act of creating. It's the failure to take responsibility for what has been created. And it's the failure that provokes the creature onto his murderous rampage and to the tragedy that ensues. Now, you might be well asking, how do we get to Frankenfarms from this, or Frankenfoods? Well, if you were like me when I began work on this project, you would suspect or implicate some of the Frankenstein movies of the 20th century. And I'll remind, actually, I won't remind you yet. Frankenstein was in fact first brought to film as early as 1910. Thomas Edison made a silent film version of the of the novel. It was a terrible flop, and so little known. But I suspected it was the movies, but I think that I was surprised to learn that there was a great deal of saliency to Mary Shelley's conception of things out of control to 19th and early 20th century readers and writers. Already in 1831, Mary Shelley realized that the creature that she had fashioned had escaped her control. What she called her hideous progeny had already gone off into the world. And I think that this is the first sort of usage of Frankenstein subsequent to the 1818 novel. It's an engraving by the very famous English engraver George Cruikshank called Tugging at an Eye Tooth. You can't really see it in this particular print, but the books on the shelves are, A Life of Pain, Pain and Suffering, and Frankenstein is also up there. In 1823, Mary Shelley received a letter from her father telling her that a version of her novel, an unauthorized version, was being presented at the English Opera House. It was a play called Presumption, and it set the pattern for many of the subsequent adaptations of the novel. And in the play emphasizes sort of the fatal consequences of the presumption, which attempts to penetrate beyond the prescribed depths into the mysteries of nature. So a cautionary tale about pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Mary Shelley attended a performance with this actor, T.P. Cook. She was amused by his identification in the playbill. He was identified by a question mark because the monster has no name. At that point, the monster and the creator did not share the name, Frankenstein. And for this role, he apparently, you can't see it in this picture, but wore blue body paint, had his, greenish lips painted black, and he would be the face that most people would associate with the monster in the 19th century. And I think you're going to recognize the face most people would associate with a monster in the 20th century. Well, by the 1840s, in fact, Frankenstein had entered the popular vocabulary. This is actually the frontispiece of the 1831 edition. It was a revised version of the novel, and this is the first sort of illustration of Frankenstein's creature here. And it's also the first edition in which Mary Shelley's name actually appears on the text. Here, a better image of the creature, Mary Shelley and her hideous progeny. Oh, here we are. As I said, political cartoonists used Frankenstein images to convey things that were out of control. This is a British cartoon for the comic magazine Punch that casts the working class and the Irish as things out of control, things that menace good English gentlemen. So this is the working class. Here's the Irish Frankenstein. And another, again, of the Irish Frankenstein. And of course, the English have a long tradition of regarding the Irish as less than human. And here it's sort of freakish stature, the horns coming out, sort of the menace to the good English gentleman. And I would submit that this political imagery was not limited to England. In the United States, the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner labeled the Confederate South in the course of a debate on the morality of slavery as the soulless monster of Frankenstein, the wretched creation of mortal science without God. Another American use somewhat later in the century is this is the railroads and the Railroad Trust presented as the Frankenstein monster, a threat to the US Constitution and to working men. Now, the usage wasn't limited to politics in the 19th century, but actually you begin seeing it in references to medicine and surgery. This is the earliest one that I found in the United States from an obscure publication, the Daily Alta, in October 1871, and it's referring to a nice surgical operation. That's the headline. But actually it reads, Mary Shelley's fearful creation Frankenstein will presently take its place among possibilities if science and surgery continue to advance. And actually, it's an article about the introduction of skin grafting to cover, this was a new procedure in the 1870s and 1880s, and particularly for a young woman who's had lost her scalp as a result of being entangled in a piece of machinery. Now, another early and political use of Frankenstein, I would submit, I came across in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1910. And I did not suspect it there in an article on the Negro as a health problem. And this article, not surprisingly, discusses sort of higher rates of tuberculosis and syphilis among sort of now the newly emancipated slaves. And bemoans the fact that Negroes would have received much better care under slavery, did it still exist. But it ends with an invocation of Frankenstein. Miscegenation in the North is certainly at this day more in evidence than it is in the South. And if decided steps are not taken against this curse by the white people of that country, they are creating for their descendants a Frankenstein monster indeed. This is before the films. And so this is my Edison picture, just to show you sort of Charles Ogle Stanton as the monster. But as I said, it was a terrible flop. But the real power of the filmic Frankenstein came with this man, who was then an unknown actor named Boris Karloff. And part of the power of this image sort of was the very effective makeup that was created by Jack Pierce. This is an advertisement of this film. It warned, and some of the advertisements warned people with weak hearts not to attend this thing. They arranged to have nurses on duty in the theaters with smelling salts and tonics to revive people when they saw this terrible thing. Now, I have to say that they also tried to increase the terror quotient by having people shoot off guns in the theater, which must have, provided extra stimulation. But the gruesomeness of this particular production was particularly where Frankenstein where his assistant salvages body parts was such that it was banned. The film was banned in a number of countries. I have yet to find out if it was banned in Germany, however. And again, part of it, the appeal was its the very effective makeup that was used. The makeup designer had designed a 5-pound metal brace to produce the stilted walk, and so on. Now, what I'm going to say is going to shock you. Hollywood filmmakers did take liberties with the novel. They made a number of changes in adapting it for the screen. Now, some were minor, and to me, inexplicable. They changed the name of the scientist from Victor to Henry. I don't know why. But other changes were much more substantial. It was in the 1931 film, for example, that you have sort of introduced the substitution of the criminal brain for the normal brain of an eminent scientist. And this, of course, was a development that was brilliantly parodied in Young Frankenstein when Igor, played by Marty Feldman, drops the brain he was ordered to obtain and brings the brain of A.B. Normal. Now, in her novel, Mary Shelley ascribed the crimes that the creature commits to his profound alienation from human society, to the abandonment he suffers at the hands of his creator. And she doubtless would have been shocked to learn that he was evil in the film because he had received a criminal brain. But of course, such biological determinism was very popular in America and in Germany and the West in the early 20th century. And for example, at the Second International Exhibition of Eugenics, which was held in 1923, this is an exhibit that appeared. It was from the Massachusetts Department of Mental Diseases, which exhibited these photographs of 50 diseased brains, analyzing the physical differences, the weight, the shape, the number of fissures between the brains of men who were rapists, perverts, vagrants, and normal men. Now, in making the film in 1931, the choices by the filmmakers also reflected great interest in the 1930s between the boundary of life and death itself. And just as Mary Shelley had drawn on contemporary developments in the early 19th century in galvanism, sort of the excitation of tissue with electrical current and blood transfusion, the Universal filmmakers drew on intense interest in the 1930s in efforts to achieve immortality through organ transplantation and artificial organs. One of the scientists who generated intense interest in this period was Robert Cornish, who actually killed dogs and then reanimated them. And he had a genius for self-promotion, naming his dogs Lazarus 1 through 4, and Lazarus the Fourth made it, appeared in such popular science monthly as Can Science Raise the Dead? Now, there was a concern that being reanimated from the dead would alter your psyche. And in newspaper articles reporting the Cornish experiments, there shown with one of the dogs, the fear that such experimentation on a human being would evolve a fiendish Frankenstein monster prevented Cornish from accepting hundreds of offers from people who volunteered to be killed and then revived. He did not accept any of these offers, but he did petition the governors of Arizona, Colorado, and Nevada for permission to experiment on newly executed criminals. He was not granted permission for that. But among other developments that really excited interest in this decade were those of the eminent aviator, Charles Lindbergh, and the eminent French scientist, physician surgeon, Alexis Carrel, who they were both independently famous in their own right, but they collaborated in 1936 to create the glass heart, which was actually intended to be a perfusion pump that was intended to keep organs sort of outside of the body in a perfused state, with the idea that they would correct the defect in the body and then reimplant the organs. Here it is, sort of, there's one still at the Smithsonian. And there was remarkable enthusiasm and interest in the 1930s about the possibilities of culturing organs, the idea that and Alexis Carrel, no stranger to fascism and the Nazi movement, said, "We are opening to experiment a forbidden field, the living human body." Now, the 1930s also saw the introduction of the first artificial pacemakers. The New York cardiologist Albert Hyman actually constructed a device, this was an external pacemaker, to restore normal heart rhythm to a heart that had stopped beating. And sensational accounts of this pacemaker in the popular press actually created a public backlash against him. He received a number of threats from people. There were letters threatening lawsuits who claimed that his device threatened God's will. And I mentioned the pacemaker because it made its first public appearance actually in this film, The Bride of Frankenstein. This is how many people learned about cardiac pacemakers in films like this. Now, I would suggest that much of the durability of the Frankenstein myth reflects the power of screen culture. We're a very visual culture, to concentrate our collective experience and images in the minds of mass audiences. And Frankenstein, of course, lived on not just in the Universal Studio sequels, but in such forgettable films as I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, or, the Munsters on TV. Now, myths, I would suggest, maintain their significance by being retold and reworked in more contemporary idioms. And perhaps in light of the startling developments in the sciences in the 20th century, it's not surprising that Frankenstein, with its versatility and power, could be effectively deployed to respond to these. And this includes developments not just in the biological sciences, but in the physical sciences. In 1945, the NBC announcer H.V. Kaltenborn broadcast on the day that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and said, "For all we know, we have created a Frankenstein." And similarly, in discussions that followed at the Atomic Energy Commission in October of 1949, when they were debating whether or not to go forward with work on a hydrogen bomb, the Harvard professor, James B. Conant, flatly opposed the project on the grounds that we've built one Frankenstein already. Enough is enough. Frankenstein, of course, has been especially versatile, however, for the biomedical sciences. And although much of the discussion about, or much of the Frankenstein literature and references have gone to discussions about genetic research, I would argue that it was actually organ transplants, especially the heart transplant, that became very fertile ground for reinventing the Frankenstein legend before the 1970s. In 1955, the apartheid government of South Africa actually banned Mary Shelley's novel as both objectionable and obscene. Now, that government did not need a lot of encouragement to ban books. The same year, they also banned Black Beauty. It's a story about a horse. But they probably did not appreciate how critics of the apartheid government identified the creation of minority white rule in South Africa as a Frankenstein creation. And in fact, in 1961, when Chief Albert Luthuli, a member of the African National Congress, accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, he described the cult of racial superiority in South Africa as a monster created by Frankenstein. That is the tragedy of the South African scene. And in 1967, a South African man actually internalized the Frankenstein story. That man was Louis Waskansky. He was a patient of Christian Barnard, the surgeon, the recipient of a heart from a young woman, Denise Darval. And when Waskansky recovered from the surgery and he was able to speak, he announced to his doctors and nurses, "I am the new Frankenstein." This is 1967. And similarly, commentators both in the United States and in Great Britain labeled the Cape Town miracle Frankenstein in South Africa. There's Christian Barnard on the cover of Time. In the editorial in Saturday Evening Post, they compare him to the actor who played Frankenstein, Henry Frankenstein, in the 1931 film. But of course, it was in the summer of 1976 and amid the great controversy over recombinant DNA research that the mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, voiced strong opposition to having recombinant DNA research in the city of Cambridge. And he was quoted as saying, "We want to be damn sure that the people of Cambridge won't be affected by anything that could crawl out of the laboratory. They may come up with a disease that cannot be cured. Is this the answer to Dr. Frankenstein's dream?" When Scottish researcher Ian Wilmot announced the successful cloning of Dolly in 1997, and she is now deceased, the Frankenstein myth received renewed attention. And there's references to the Frankenstein syndrome being unleashed by this. And most recently, this is the most recent incarnation I've found of the stem cell controversy. Is it possible to forsake or forget Frankenstein? I don't think so. I think it's a testament to the story's enduring power that it remains so strongly rooted in our popular imagination, nearly 2 centuries after its creation by Mary Shelley. But if we cannot forgo Frankenstein, there are alternative traditions that we might invoke, ones that won't rigidly constrain us as much as the Frankenstein myth does. Well, some ethicists and philosophers have pointed to the golem legend. The golem is a creature of Jewish legend. It is made by men out of clay and water. There's incantation, prayer. But the golem will do man's bidding, but it often does so in a clumsy and dangerous way. And without appropriate information or guidance from its creator, it will create mayhem. Although Mary Shelley may not have been familiar with this golem legend, she would have sympathized, I think, with the desire to create the golem and also the necessity of administering it with wisdom. And this is why I think it may be possible for us to reverse the narrowing and distortion of the Frankenstein novel into the Frankenstein myth. Sort of despite the dark fears that the Frankenstein monster and Frankenstein science have incited, I think it's useful to remember the the ambiguously optimistic tone with which Mary Shelley ends her tragic tale. In the novel, if many of you have read it, you might recall the story ends in the icy waters of the frozen north. Victor Frankenstein lies dying on the ship of another explorer seeking to advance knowledge. That is the Arctic explorer, Robert Walton. And after telling Robert Walton his strange tale of the creation of the monster and the tragedy that ensues, Victor Frankenstein bids the explorer farewell, but offers this final advice. Seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be apparently the innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries. Yet why do I say this? I myself have been blasted in these hopes, yet another may succeed. I think a cautiously optimistic. And here I put remember the subtitle of Mary Shelley's novel is The Modern Prometheus, and the Prometheus myth was very influential in Mary Shelley's circle. Prometheus, like the Golem legend, created humans out of clay and water, but he angered the gods by bringing fire to his creation, and as a punishment, he was sentenced by Zeus and the other gods to an eternity in which his liver would be yanked out by an eagle or a hawk. But when Mary Shelley prepared the poem written by her husband in 1822, after Percy Shelley's death, she explained that Prometheus used knowledge as a weapon to defeat evil by leading mankind where in the state they are sinless through ignorance to that in which they are virtuous through wisdom. And so let me just say that Victor Frankenstein desired to renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. And this was no mean desire. It's one that we share with the medical Prometheans of Shelley's day. And it's the Promethean possibility that I would suggest ignites our interest in the Frankenstein myth. We share Victor Frankenstein's dream to pour a torrent of light onto this dark world. We too seek the renewal of life and the reversal of the processes of disease. But the possibility of mastering the natural world is at once appalling and appealing. And will we have the ability to be virtuous through wisdom? Thank you.